we can see here also that because we have our revenue here that kind of starts following our costs, and the costs keep increasing in a predictable manner, but the revenue suddenly kind of collapses in recent years. And this is because the price is too low and because inflation is eating up the value of that price, the value of that revenue. This is adjusted for inflation. It's becoming a major issue, but I think
maybe you can also talk about the government does have a road electrification plan, but does not sit in Ministry of Electricity and Energy and the kind of financial support on that, and really widespread mini grids in the country.
Yeah, so electrification in Myanmar was a big issue for since independence. What we see is that during the years of high inflation and complete autarky, separation of Myanmar from the rest of the universe, the government lacked resources to invest in electrification. And so what the government did was they told the villagers, I'm caricaturing here, but this is the gist of it, we don't have the money to bring electricity to you. So form a committee, which was called the Village Electrification Committee. Form a committee, purchase a diesel generator, hire a contractor to build the lines in your village, and then you can apply to us and we will supply the fuel for that. You're still buying it, but you're buying it from the ministry. This was the deal starting in the 1990s. It was basically it was decentralization as a way of compensating for the lack of resources of the central government. This explains why we have several thousand mini grids in Myanmar that are diesel based. And so for a very long time the power sector was very decentralized, and now what we have is, since 2008, the paradox is that the 2008 Constitution introduced much more decentralization of power, but the power sector became much more centralized. Because the central government, as soon as it got more resources to invest in electrification and in the power sector, said to the states and regions, actually, we're taking back the hand here, we're taking back control. An illustration of this is that they decided to place the responsibility for off-grid electrification, meaning solar home systems and mini grids, in another ministry. Off-grid electrification is not managed by the Ministry of Electricity and Energy. It is managed by the Ministry of Agriculture, Livestock and Irrigation, in a department that is called the Department of Rural Development. Different budget, different people, completely different organizational culture. It's a different world. And so I think that illustrates the fact that the Ministry of Electricity and Energy is starting to consider that off-grid electrification is kind of the stuff of hippies. And this is not my view, of course, but believe me, the Ministry of Electricity and Energy in Myanmar, as in many countries that are just starting to open up, is basically made of very old school engineers. Electrical engineers, the more senior ones educated in the former Soviet Union, they have a very centralized view of how this kind of infrastructure development happens. And so these kinds of small projects, like grid electrification, mini grid electrification, it's not really their priority.
So just to clarify, so those microgrids are powered by diesel engines?
Not only diesel, maybe mini hydro.
Mostly diesel, but also a lot of like mini hydro, pico hydro.
Sure, but for the diesel engines, they get their fuel from government?
At the time, yes.
And
now, no.
Now, no. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Now they purchase themselves.
Okay, so they're completely on their own now.
Yes.
Basically, they don't create any revenue stream for the government at this moment.
No.
Okay.
They're on their own. And it's much more expensive than these mini grids. Here's an illustration of the price difference between Myanmar at the bottom. This is for household consumption. as a function of how much you use and your price in USD. The highest price in Myanmar is lower than the lowest price in ASEAN. Right? Yeah, there is a plan, there is a plan in the government to increase prices. There's been a plan since December, but no one has yet to press the red button. No, this is not relevant anymore to our discussion. Why does Myanmar matter, and why does Myanmar matter to China specifically? I think it's been no mystery. Okay, I'll kind of get out of the energy space for a second here. For a very long time, Myanmar was the space that occupies, that the Myanmar state today occupies, was sort of off the map. We start mapping Myanmar very, very late, actually, in history, in part because of wind patterns and because of sailing trading routes. Ships just didn't stop in this part of the world, and so it's not only that Burma was off the map during the period of military rule. Myanmar has been off the map for centuries, if not millennia. And this is changing now, and very clearly the Chinese state understands this. And I would say that Western companies understand this probably more than Western governments. We know the location of this pipeline connecting to Kunming. I think we also see that just if you look at how Thailand is behaving, Thailand understands now that Myanmar is set to become a regional competitor for Thailand, which gives you a sense of, I think today we could say that Thailand is like 40 years ahead in terms of development, infrastructure development, ahead of Myanmar, but they're clearly aware that Myanmar will catch up if everything goes to plan, according to plan. I think there's tremendous potential, but there's also tremendous potential for violence, failure, conflict. We've already seen this, but I think we've only seen they've managed to, in Myanmar and I think minorities have managed to kind of maintain a sort of low intensity conflict for decades and manage this not decently, don't quote me on that. But it's remarkable. You can see, for example, in Kachin, you have a dam that is operated by the Kachin independence group. They are selling power. They have a contract with the local Tatmadaw base, military, Myanmar base, right? You have these weird relationships around energy in Myanmar where there's conflict, but conflict is approached in a different way than at least I was taught in Western institutions. It's a different approach to conflict, and you can be fighting and at the same time still be trading. Yeah, it's a very strange. And at the same time, the national grid is selling power to areas that are that are out of the control of the central government, right? So it's these very strange relationships that are beyond my limited understanding of things. Yeah, that's all. Do you have any further questions?
Maybe quickly mention about the white paper about hydropower that China is supporting the ministry.
Yeah. I think we're seeing in general. Today we're tagging a bunch of projects as being Belt and Road, but I think we were already talking about all these different projects before Belt and Road, and I think it's becoming a label that is coming late in the game, but actually China has been the trend of Western countries supplying aid and sending companies to invest in Myanmar, and then gradually, especially since the crisis in Rakhine and the Rohingya crisis, these actors kind of slowing down their investment or pulling out or having doubts. And then, as soon as there was doubt about Western involvement in Myanmar, very justifiably, both China, number one, and number two, India, jumped in to occupy that space. I think there's one clear case of this, which is that the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group, wrote a paper called the Strategic Environmental Assessment, SEA. It was supposed to plan how an optimal way of developing the power sector in Myanmar that would take into account environmental and social factors. It was not a perfect plan, it had many problems, but nevertheless, Chinese companies who were asked for feedback were really unhappy with it because of its approach, and it put strict limitations on where companies could build dams. As a result of this, they gave their feedback to the IFC, and then I believe that they spoke with the ministry also, and then the ministry decided to not sign this paper, this SEA, and then there was a visit to Yunnan by government officials, and they came back with an implicit agreement to let China draft a hydropower white paper that would be a direct competitor to that original strategic environmental assessment. And I think it's quite clear that whatever the recommendations of that paper, and it's obvious that China has probably more experience in hydro than any other country in the world. I doubt that that paper will take into account, will give as much weight at least to certain factors. I'm saying this in light of recent declarations regarding Mizon, regarding the ambassador's declarations in Kachin and these kinds of things. If that is any reflection of how that paper would look like, that does seem like a different approach from the IFC's approach. That being said, there were very legitimate criticisms of the SEA regime. Have I addressed everything?
Thanks. I mean, we can just open to the floor for more questions. Although we were already having some really good discussion while you were giving the presentation.
And I think one of the controversies surrounding Mizon Dam project sites, the majority of the electricity will go to China. But do you think the situation has changed? As you mentioned, Myanmar can import electricity from Yunnan. And is there a common will from both sides to cancel the project?
I think that, first of all, the bulk of the population is opposed to this. The bulk of the ministry staff is opposed to Mizon. The leadership had come around to being willing to let it happen. I think that if it had gone through, the original deal of exporting 90% of power to China would have been revised. I mean, Yunnan today is in overcapacity of electricity, and by a big margin. So it would make no sense at this point for China to import power from Myanmar. I think what might have happened, for example, would have been a deal where a bigger chunk of that power was reserved for Myanmar, and then the excess capacity would have been exported potentially to Bangladesh or certain parts of India that have been that are so far away from India's national grids that they still don't have stable supply. And also because part of India's electrification energy plan was based on having an LNG terminal actually on the Rakhine coast, a regasification plant there, and then a pipeline going from Rakhine through Myanmar, through Chin State, and then into India. Given the current situation, that has been put on hold. And so these parts of India that were supposed to receive this gas in order to produce electricity have a power shortage. So that might have been the deal, the revised deal from Mitsung. To be frank, I was surprised that, I mean, that just the name Mitsung has become just utterly toxic. I think if I was working for SPIC, I would not have used that approach. I would probably have tried to at least rename the thing and change the plant. Because, I mean, I see them. They come to my office all the time. Literally, SPIC, they came to my office with 2 giant chocolate cakes. And they're like, for myself and for all the local staff, like, they're very clear in their intentions. Very nice. I think there was, but I think now they're understanding that sometimes that they may have not been complete. The discourse of saying, "Oh, look, the West is infantilizing you or taking advantage of you. We are a former developing country, so we can show you the way and be more respectful of you." That discourse is not enough anymore. You need a bit more when you're talking to Myanmar. Partly because actually Myanmar can choose from China and India and Thailand and Laos. They have choice, so there's actually a competition between all these different actors to work with Myanmar. If you want my 2 cents on it, at this point it looks like Mitsung is off the table for a long time. My understanding is that Ministry has been just accumulating different announcements, looking at other alternative sources of power. They're still going ahead with adding 3,000 megawatts of LNG. That was announced in January 2018, though I have strong doubts about whether that will be on schedule and whether it will actually be 3,000 megawatts. I think it will definitely be less than that. Now they've announced 1,300 megawatts of extra LNG on top of that as an emergency measure, plus 1,000 megawatts from imported from China. If you add all of that up, plus local capacity, you end up pretty much with a total added capacity equivalent to Mitsung. So I think they're just covering their bottoms. It's all a question of how they can, how Myanmar and China can negotiate a way that lets everyone get out of this in a way that is to everyone's advantage in appearance.
Tom first.
It is kind of question of clarification, but it's something, it's a dynamic that I think is maybe quite interesting. So on this white paper that you're saying, white paper on hydro that China advised on, is it the case that was government departments and SOEs and so on in Yunnan provincial government rather than the central government? You were saying that there were visits to Kunming,
I think,
to negotiate this, and I think, if I'm correct, I think that the Laos current power plan, there was like a lot of input from China on that, and I think that came from that kind of body of ministries and experts in Yunnan province more than it came from sort of Beijing or China's central government.
It's something on which, for me, it's not very clear. There's what the NEA thing.
It's not NEA, but it's in charge of a think tank under
监规院应该是
水利部是水利部下面。
Ministry of Water Resources.
No, so actually, that, like, you know, in China, a lot of hydro state-owned company actually has a long transformation way from former government body. So the think tank, which is in charge of actually drafting the white paper, is a think tank under a state-owned company of hydro company. But I forgot the exact name.
水归总院吧？
水利。
水归总院。
对，没错，
应该是那个水归总院，水利规划
Something good. Okay.
What I meant is simply that there was a state government visit to Kunming,
Okay.
and then that was that announcement. I'm not saying that this was signed with the Yunnan administration.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And at the same time, NEA is also said to be active with the government, especially in terms of electricity trade. That's what I heard from the source.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
So I want to ask a little bit more about the natural gas, or the thinking around natural gas-based electricity, because as you mentioned, it's a pretty paradoxical situation that they use natural gas more as a base load, which natural gas is naturally not so like fit for, right? It's more flexible as a peak load energy. And when we talk to CNPC people here, we ask why, like the pipeline, right? The pipeline to Yunnan is underutilized currently. It's designed for a certain amount of natural gas every year, and it's only, I think, using 50% of its capacity now. Right? And the reason they give is that, and they also say that the profit sharing with Myanmar, Myanmar has all the rights to offload, I think, 20% of that capacity, right, from the pipeline, from natural gas, and they're not using it. The reason is that Myanmar is unable to basically absorb, right, the amount that's reserved basically for Myanmar.
That also has to do with the local pipeline network.
Okay.
The local pipeline network has big holes in it, and so transporting that gas to the gas plants in Myanmar is a problem.
Okay.
So especially from where the pipeline begins.
Talking.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, what is the general thinking about natural gas, right, as a source of electricity, and how like Myanmar's planners are sort of placing it in the future energy mix? Is it actually sort of reasonable to expect natural gas to play a much bigger role in sort of electricity generation?
I mean, clearly that's what they're going for with all these LNG plants. I think they also on the gas, local domestic gas side, they do still believe that they're going to find more gas reserves offshore that would be for domestic consumption exclusively. Actually, part of the you highlight a very good point, which is that indeed there are these holes in the pipeline network, which are currently they're building in order to accommodate the upcoming LNG plants. So connecting Chaopiu to Yangon, for example.
I think we need to move because we have a very tight schedule of meeting today. So let's move to downstairs.